Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories. Tonight we are returning once again to the oldest written memories humanity ever pressed into clay. Not to look upward, not to imagine shining arrivals from distant skies, but to turn our attention in the opposite direction, toward what was already here, toward what was already ending, toward a story that begins not with descent, but with displacement. Before we settle fully into the quiet of this exploration, take a moment to make yourself comfortable. Lower the lights if you can. Let the room soften around you. Maybe there is a familiar background sound where you are, a fan, distant traffic, rain against glass, or the quiet hum of a building settling into the night. These small details matter. They help place us in a state where listening becomes effortless. If you find this atmosphere calming, if you enjoy drifting through ancient history at this pace, you're welcome to like the video and subscribe. Only if it feels right. This space is meant to be shared gently, without urgency. And if you feel like it, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. There is something grounding about knowing that people across the world, in different hours of the night or day, are drawn to the same quiet questions. For a long time now, the story surrounding the Anunnaki has been told in one direction only. They came, they descended, they arrived. The language is always forward-moving, always downward, always framed as an intrusion into a primitive world that did not yet understand itself. In popular retellings, they step into an empty landscape, impose order, reshape humanity, and then depart. It is a story that feels dramatic, cinematic, and complete. But it is also a story that depends heavily on assumptions that the original texts themselves do not actually make. Tonight, we're going to slow that narrative down until it begins to loosen. We're going to look closely, patiently, at what the Sumerian tablets actually say, not what later interpreters hoped they would say, and not what modern imagination prefers. And when we do that, something unexpected begins to surface, a subtle shift in perspective, a reversal so quiet that it has gone largely unnoticed. The Anunnaki, as they appear in the earliest records, do not behave like newcomers. They do not speak like conquerors. They are not introduced with the language of arrival. Instead, they appear already embedded within a system that is no longer whole. This is where the idea of escape begins to matter. Not escape in the dramatic sense of fleeing in fire and light, but escape as withdrawal, as survival, as a movement away from something that had already begun to fail. The Sumerian scribes were not storytellers in the modern sense. They were record keepers. Their task was not to invent, but to preserve. They copied older tablets faithfully, even when the meaning of the words had grown obscure. They maintained formulas, lists, and ritual language long after the original context had faded. This makes their silence just as important as their statements. What they choose not to explain, not to dramatize, not to emphasize, often reveals more than what they describe in detail. And one of the most striking features of the Sumerian corpus is how little interest it shows in beginnings. The texts rarely linger on origins. They assume structure, they assume order, they assume hierarchy. When the Anunnaki appear by name, the world is already functioning. Cities exist. Temples stand. Kingship has already descended. Laws, rituals, and cosmic divisions are already in place. This is not the setting one would expect for gods who have just arrived. Instead, it feels like a world continuing after something else has already happened. If we pay attention to how the Sumerians describe movement, another pattern emerges. Descent is not emphasized. Travel is rarely detailed. There are no extended narratives of gods crossing space to reach Earth. What we see instead is language of assignment, of placement, of remaining. Gods are given domains. They are stationed. They are associated with fixed locations. And when they move, the movement is framed as retreat or removal, not arrival. This is especially important when we look at how the Anunnaki are positioned within the divine hierarchy. They are not creators of the cosmos. They are not the first generation. They are not even the second. They emerge after the primordial ordering has already occurred, after heaven and earth have been separated, after air, water, and land have been defined. Their role is administrative, judicial, regulatory. They preside over boundaries, not beginnings. This alone should make us cautious about narratives that place them as initiators of civilization. The Sumerian worldview does not frame authority as something seized or imposed. Authority descends, yes, but only once. And after that descent, everything else operates within maintenance rather than creation. The Anunnaki appear within that maintenance phase, a phase already marked by strain. Strain is a word the tablets never use directly, but it is present everywhere in implication. The gods complain of labour. The system requires constant upkeep. Order is fragile. Noise becomes a problem. Population becomes a problem. Balance becomes difficult to sustain. These are not the concerns of triumphant arrivals. They are the concerns of a structure under pressure. And it is here that the idea of escape becomes more coherent. Not escape from humanity, but escape from a prior condition, from an earlier order that demanded too much, from a system that could no longer support itself in the same way. The Anunnaki in this reading are not invaders stepping into a new world. They are figures who remain after something else has already receded. They are what is left when the highest level of direct divine presence withdraws. They do not bring humanity into existence. Humanity already exists when their role becomes defined. They do not introduce civilization. Civilization is already functioning when they begin to appear in judgment scenes and fate decrees. This reframing does not require speculative technology or hidden planets. It requires something far simpler and far more grounded. It requires reading the tablets in the order they present themselves. It requires noticing which events are treated as ancient even by the scribes themselves. It requires recognizing that the Sumerians understood time as layered, not linear. In a layered worldview, not everything moves forward. Some things sink, some things are sealed away, some things are survived rather than initiated. As we move deeper into this exploration, we will look closely at how the Anunnaki are associated not with life's beginnings, but with its limits, with the underworld, with judgment, with decisions that close doors rather than open them. These are not the roles of beings arriving to build a new world. They are the roles of beings managing the consequences of an old one. But none of this is stated outright in the tablets. The scribes never tell us that the Anunnaki escaped. They did not need to. Their audience already understood the structure of divine time. What remains for us is to listen carefully, without forcing the story to move in the direction we expect. Tonight is not about overturning belief or replacing one certainty with another. It is about letting the oldest texts speak in their own restrained way, about noticing the quiet gravity in their phrasing, about allowing the possibility that the most famous gods in Sumerian mythology were not the beginning of something extraordinary, but the continuation of something already diminished. And as we continue, we will begin to see how this subtle shift changes everything, how arrival gives way to aftermath, how power begins to look less like conquest and more like burden, how the gods themselves appear bound by a system they did not design, trying to preserve what remains rather than expand what once was. The tablets do not rush this realization. Neither will we. When we approach the Sumerian tablets with modern expectations, we often carry an assumption so deep that we rarely notice it shaping our reading. We expect beginnings to be dramatic. We expect arrivals to be announced. We expect important figures to enter the story with motion, with emphasis, with explanation. We are accustomed to narratives that open doors, that show us where someone came from, how they travelled, and why they arrived. But the Sumerian texts were not composed to satisfy that kind of curiosity. They were not written to entertain, persuade, or impress. They were written to preserve continuity in a world where continuity itself felt fragile. This difference in purpose matters more than almost anything else when we begin to notice a peculiar pattern in the tablets. Again and again, what stands out is not what is described in detail, but what is not. There are lists of gods, lists of kings, lists of cities, lists of rituals, lists of offerings. There are accounts of judgments, decrees, punishments, floods, withdrawals, deaths, and transfers of authority. But when it comes to arrival, to the act of coming into the world from elsewhere, the language grows thin. Sometimes it vanishes entirely. This is not because the scribes were careless. It is because arrival, in their worldview, was not the most important moment. Aftermath was. The Sumerians lived in an environment where aftermath was unavoidable. Floods did not announce themselves politely. A river could rise silently overnight, erasing fields, homes, and lives by morning. Cities were built, destroyed, rebuilt, and destroyed again on the same ground, layer upon layer, each generation standing atop the remains of the last. Memory was not a clean line forward. It was sediment. What survived mattered more than how it began. When we read the tablets with this in mind, the absence of arrival narrative stops looking like an omission and starts looking like a choice. The earliest Sumerian texts assume a world already in motion. They do not begin with a blank slate. They begin with structure. Heaven and earth are already separated. Water already flows. Wind already moves. Authority already exists. The gods are already named. Their relationships are already established. Even conflict is already present. This is not a cosmos being introduced. It is a cosmos being managed. When divine figures appear, they are not framed as newcomers stepping into unfamiliar territory. They are framed as inheritors of roles. They are assigned domains. They are stationed in cities. They are associated with specific functions that already carry weight and consequence. This language belongs to a system that has been operating for some time, not one that has just been installed. Consider how often the tablets explain why something changed, but not how it began. A city is destroyed because of a divine displeasure. A king loses favour because he violated ritual order. Humanity is reduced because its noise became unbearable. The flood comes because balance failed. These explanations are always retrospective. They tell us why a previous state could not continue. They do not pause to describe the moment that state was established. This focus on consequence over origin becomes even clearer when we look at how the gods themselves are portrayed. They are not omniscient architects calmly executing a perfect plan. They complain, they argue, they misjudge, they regret, they react. These are not the behaviours of beings arriving confidently to impose order. They are the behaviours of beings operating inside a system that demands constant correction, and correction is always backward-looking. The Anunnaki, when they appear in the texts, are not introduced with spectacle. There is no scene where they descend. There is no description of their first appearance. There is no moment when humanity sees them arrive and reacts in awe or confusion. Instead, they are simply there, present, counted, named, assigned. Their presence is treated as a given. What receives attention instead is what follows from their presence. Judgments are issued. Fates are determined. Boundaries are enforced. The dead are processed. Authority is exercised not to create, but to contain. The underworld becomes central. Limits become important. Rules are reiterated. This is aftermath language. Even the grammar of the tablets reflects this orientation. Verbs frequently describe states rather than actions. Being rather than coming. Remaining rather than entering. Sitting rather than moving. When movement does occur, it is often framed as leaving, descending into confinement, withdrawing to a distant place, or being removed from circulation. This is especially telling when we look at how rarely the tablets describe return. Departure is final. Withdrawal is permanent. Once a god recedes, that absence becomes part of the structure of the world. The texts do not anticipate a triumphant comeback. They do not build expectation, they adapt to loss. This adaptation tells us something essential about how the Sumerians understood divine time. For them, the most dangerous moment was not creation. It was instability. The most urgent task was not to explain how something came to be, but to explain why it no longer functioned as it once did. In such a worldview, arrival is only meaningful if it changes the balance, and if it does not, it requires no explanation. The Anunnaki do not change the balance by arriving. They appear after the balance has already shifted. Their role is not to initiate a new era, but to manage the consequences of an older one that has already begun to fracture. This is why they are associated with judgment rather than creation, with fate rather than innovation, with boundaries rather than expansion. If they had arrived in the dramatic sense often imagined today, the tablets would have treated that moment as significant. The Sumerians were meticulous record keepers. They catalogued eclipses, omens, unusual births, strange weather, and rare celestial events. They did not ignore disruptions. If gods had arrived from elsewhere in a way that altered the world, that alteration would have been noted. Instead, what we see is continuity under strain. This becomes even clearer when we examine the way temples function in the texts. Temples are not described as welcoming centres celebrating divine arrival. They are described as points of stabilization. They anchor gods to specific locations. They regulate access. They formalize relationships. Offerings are not gifts to impress newcomers. They are maintenance payments, sustaining arrangements that already exist and that require constant reinforcement. A system that requires constant reinforcement is not new. It is aging. The tablets often read like documents written by people living after something immense has already withdrawn from direct experience. The gods are present, but at a distance. Communication requires ritual. Access requires mediation. Signs replace speech. Omens replace instruction. Dreams replace direct appearance. This is not the language of arrival. It is the language of aftermath. Even myths that describe creation do so with a sense of compression, as if summarizing events too old to be fully remembered. Details blur. Names remain, but actions become schematic. What survives is not narrative richness, but structural memory. Enough to keep the system functioning, not enough to reconstruct the original state. This pattern repeats when we look at how authority is transferred. Kingship descends once. After that it is inherited, contested, lost, restored, and lost again. The descent itself is never reenacted. It becomes a fixed point in the distant past, referenced, but not revisited. Everything else is aftermath. If the Anunnaki were arrivals, they would belong to that singular moment. But they do not. They belong to the long period of adjustment that follows. This also explains why the tablets are so concerned with enumeration. Gods are counted. Judges are numbered. Gates are tallied. Years are listed. Reigns are measured. Counting is an act of control. It is what you do when something has already slipped beyond direct grasp and must be managed symbolically. Arrival narratives inspire storytelling. Aftermath narratives inspire accounting. The Sumerian tablets are overwhelmingly accounting documents, even when they are mythic. They account for loss, for obligation, for responsibility, for limitation. They record what must be done to prevent collapse, not how collapse was avoided in the first place. In this context, the silence around arrival stops being mysterious. It becomes consistent. The scribes were not interested in where the Anunnaki came from because, in their lived reality, what mattered was what remained and how to live with it. This is why modern readings that emphasize arrival often feel strained. They push the text to speak in a voice they do not naturally use. They search for spectacle where the tablets offer administration. They search for beginnings where the tablets preserve endings. And once we accept that the Sumerian worldview is aftermath-oriented, the idea that the Anunnaki represent escape rather than invasion begins to feel less radical. Escape is an aftermath concept. It belongs to systems under pressure, to structures shedding weight, to survivals rather than conquests. The tablets do not celebrate the Anunnaki's presence. They accommodate it. They integrate it into a framework already dealing with loss. That alone tells us we are not witnessing a story of arrival, but a story unfolding in the long shadow of something that has already gone. And as we move forward, this shadow will only become more defined. By the time the name Anunnaki appears in the Sumerian record, the world they inhabit is already settled into its shape. Not perfected, not peaceful, not stable in the way later traditions would imagine paradise, but structured. Boundaries exist, roles are defined, authority has a lineage. Nothing about the setting suggests a fresh beginning. Everything suggests continuation. This is one of the most easily overlooked facts in the entire discussion surrounding the Anunnaki, precisely because it is so quiet. There is no announcement, no declaration that a new class of gods has entered the stage, no description of a world reacting to their presence. The name simply appears, embedded in a system that has already been operating long enough to develop stress fractures. The Sumerian scribes did not introduce the Anunnaki the way later mythologies introduce new divine actors. There is no narrative pause to explain who they are for the benefit of a reader encountering them for the first time. There is no genealogical build-up designed to dramatize their importance. Instead, they are listed, counted, invoked, and assigned function. This alone tells us something essential about how the scribes understood their place in cosmic time. They were not new. To understand how significant this is, it helps to look at what is explained in detail when the tablets deal with genuinely foundational moments. The separation of heaven and earth is described carefully, even if briefly. The emergence of air as a domain is given weight. The establishment of kingship receives a formal declaration. These moments are treated as singular events, things that happened once and then shaped everything that followed. The Anunnaki are never framed this way. When their name enters the record, the structure of the cosmos is already complete. Heaven exists as a defined realm. Earth exists as another. The underworld has boundaries. Rivers have courses. Cities have names. Temples have locations. Priestly roles exist. Ritual calendars are in motion. Even humanity's purpose has already been articulated in earlier compositions. None of this is tentative. None of it is experimental. It is functioning, even if imperfectly. This matters because arrival narratives typically coincide with disruption. When something genuinely new enters a system, the system reacts. Language shifts, explanations multiply. Sumerian texts do this when writing itself is introduced, when kingship descends, when the flood reshapes the world. But when the Anunnaki appear by name, the language remains procedural. They are slotted into an existing order. Their earliest appearances associate them with judgment, decree, and the underworld. These are not frontier roles. They are not exploratory. They are not creative in the generative sense. They are custodial. They preside over limits that already exist. They enforce outcomes that have already been set in motion. This is especially striking when we compare the Anunnaki to earlier divine figures whose names appear in the texts. Those earlier figures are tied directly to cosmic formation. Their actions shape the environment itself. By contrast, the Anunnaki inherit an environment. They do not mould it, they administer it. The Sumerian worldview is deeply hierarchical, but it is also deeply temporal. Not all gods belong to the same moment. Some are primordial, some are structural, some are administrative. The Anunnaki belong firmly to the latter category. Their authority does not come from being first. It comes from being positioned where pressure accumulates. This becomes clearer when we examine the context in which their name appears. They are invoked during moments of reckoning. They are named when fate is being fixed. They are counted when judgment is rendered. They are present when boundaries are enforced between life and death. These are not the scenes one would expect if they were newly arrived architects of civilization. If anything, their role suggests that civilization has reached a point where such enforcement is necessary. A world that requires judges is not a world in its infancy. It is a world managing complexity. It is a world dealing with overflow, conflict, excess, and consequence. The Anunnaki appear precisely when the system needs containment. This containment theme runs quietly through the tablets. Humanity multiplies, noise increases, balance becomes difficult to maintain, labour becomes burdensome. Decisions are made not to expand but to reduce. Lifespans shorten, floods reset, access to divine presence becomes restricted. These are all signs of a system pulling inward, not pushing outward. And the Anunnaki emerge into this inward pull. Even their association with the underworld reinforces this interpretation. The underworld in Sumerian thought is not a place of punishment alone. It is a place of accounting, a final domain where outcomes are fixed and movement ceases. It exists because the living world cannot absorb everything indefinitely. Something must be removed from circulation. A world that has developed an underworld has already passed its moment of unlimited expansion. The Anunnaki are positioned precisely at this threshold. They do not preside over life's beginning, but over its conclusion. They are not the ones who set the world in motion, but the ones who ensure it does not spin out of control. This is why the tablets never bother to describe the moment they begin to exist. From the scribe's perspective, they have always been part of the system as it currently functions. Their origin lies beyond the horizon of practical concern. Contrast this with how the Sumerians treat humanity's origin. That story is told, retold, debated, and modified. Humanity's purpose is explained. Its creation is justified. Its flaws are explored. Humanity is new relative to the system. It requires explanation. The Anunnaki do not. This difference should caution us against projecting modern narratives of arrival onto ancient texts. The idea that powerful beings must have come from somewhere else to explain their authority is a modern impulse, shaped by exploration, colonization, and technological imagination. The Sumerian impulse was different. Authority did not need to arrive if it had already been assigned. In the tablets, power flows downward through decree, not outward through movement. What matters is not where a god came from, but what domain they hold and what responsibilities they bear. The Anunnaki's domain is never described as newly claimed. It is described as already theirs. This also explains why they are so often grouped rather than individualized. They function collectively. They are counted as a set, 7 judges, a council, a body. This is bureaucratic language, not heroic language. Bureaucracies do not form at the beginning of systems. They form when systems become large enough to require regulation. The Sumerian cosmos, by the time the Anunnaki are named, has reached that stage. Even the way their name is constructed reinforces this. It emphasizes lineage and status rather than action. They are defined by descent within an existing hierarchy, not by a dramatic act that distinguishes them from what came before. Their authority is inherited, not seized. If they were arrivals, the texts would have needed to reconcile that arrival with the already established authority of older gods. Conflict would be inevitable, but the tablets show no such conflict. The Anunnaki do not challenge the existing order. They operate within it. This suggests something subtle but profound. The world did not change when the Anunnaki appeared by name because the world they inhabited was already the aftermath of a larger change. They are not the beginning of decline, but part of the response to it. Seen this way, their presence feels less like an intrusion and more like a residue. They remain where others no longer do. They preside where direct intervention has receded. They occupy the administrative layers left behind when more immediate forms of divine engagement have withdrawn. This perspective also explains why later traditions struggled to reinterpret them. As cultures changed, as distance from the original worldview increased, the function-first nature of the Anunnaki became harder to understand. It was easier to imagine them as visitors than as remnants, easier to imagine arrival than escape. But the tablets themselves resist that reimagining. They are stubbornly grounded in continuity. They do not give us the narrative satisfaction of a clear beginning. They give us something more ambiguous and in many ways more unsettling. A world that is already ordered, already strained, already moving toward limitation by the time the Anunnaki step fully into view. And from that point forward, everything they touch bears the mark of a system no longer expanding, but enduring. When the Sumerian tablets speak about gods taking their places in the world, the language they use is careful, restrained, and remarkably consistent. It is not the language of movement through space. It is not the language of arrival from elsewhere. It is the language of placement, of assignment, of being set where one belongs within a structure that already exists. This distinction may seem subtle at first, but once noticed, it becomes impossible to ignore. Modern retellings of ancient mythology often lean heavily on verbs of descent. Gods come down, they fall, they arrive from above, they cross boundaries dramatically. These are powerful images, and they resonate deeply with later religious traditions and with modern imagination. But when we return to the Sumerian texts themselves, that imagery largely dissolves. Instead of descent, we find allocation. Instead of arrival, we find positioning. The gods are said to be established in their domains. They are set in cities. They hold authority over particular realms. They sit in judgment. They remain in their appointed places. These are not verbs that describe travel. They describe occupancy. They describe stability. They describe a system in which everything has a designated location, and deviation from that location is disruptive. This is especially important when considering the Anunnaki. Their association with the underworld, judgment, and fate is almost always described through language that implies permanence. They are not passing through. They are not visiting. They are stationed. They preside. They remain. The underworld itself is never portrayed as a destination reached through descent in the dramatic sense modern readers might expect. It is not introduced as a place one travels to in a narrative arc. It simply exists. It is below, yes, but not as the result of a journey. It is below as part of the structure of reality, and the Anunnaki are there because that is where their function belongs. This matters because descent implies origin elsewhere. Placement does not. When something descends, it comes from above. When something is placed, it is positioned within a framework. The Sumerian texts overwhelmingly favour the second mode of description. Gods are placed in heaven, on earth, or below. Cities are placed on the plain. Kings are placed on thrones. Statues are placed in temples. Ritual objects are placed in precise locations. Everything has its correct position, and disorder arises when something is out of place. This obsession with proper placement reflects the Sumerian understanding of order itself. Order was not something created once and left alone. It was something maintained through constant attention to boundaries and positions. The cosmos functioned because each element stayed where it belonged. In such a worldview, arrival narratives would be disruptive. They would raise questions the system was not designed to answer. Where did this being come from? Why now? What does its arrival change? The Sumerian texts rarely ask these questions because the system they describe is not oriented toward novelty. It is oriented toward stability. The Anunnaki are introduced not as novelties, but as necessary components of that stability. Even when the texts describe divine movement, the movement is usually lateral or internal rather than vertical. Gods shift roles. They withdraw from direct involvement. They delegate. They retreat to distant realms. They send messengers. But they do not arrive in the sense of entering the cosmos from outside it. This is one of the clearest indicators that the Anunnaki were not conceptualized as outsiders. They were insiders whose placement had meaning precisely because the system was already closed. Consider how the tablets handle the idea of heaven itself. Heaven is not a place one reaches by travelling upward. It is a domain that exists above by definition. Gods associated with heaven are there because they belong there. Their authority flows downward, but their bodies do not necessarily move. Communication happens through signs, dreams, omens, and decrees, not through physical descent. This distinction becomes even sharper when we look at how rare explicit travel descriptions are in the Sumerian corpus. When gods truly move from one realm to another, it is treated as dangerous, exceptional, and often irreversible. Inanna's descent into the underworld is not a casual journey. It is a transgression. It requires the surrender of power at each gate. It results in death. It disrupts the balance so severely that intervention is required to restore order. If descent itself were a normal mode of divine action, this story would not carry such weight. The fact that descent is portrayed as extraordinary rather than routine tells us that the default mode of divine existence was fixed placement. Gods stayed where they belonged. Crossing boundaries was costly. Seen in this light, the absence of descent narratives for the Anunnaki becomes meaningful. If they had descended from elsewhere into the world, that descent would have required explanation, justification, and consequence. The texts provide none of this. They simply present the Anunnaki as already occupying their roles. This strongly suggests that their presence was understood as structural, not transitional. The language used to describe divine authority reinforces this point. Authority is said to rest with a god. It is held. It is assigned. It belongs. These are static terms. They do not imply movement through space or time. They imply position within a hierarchy. The Anunnaki hold authority over fate and judgment. That authority is not said to arrive with them. It is simply theirs. It is part of the system. Even when later texts reflect on earlier times, they do so without introducing arrival as a concept. They speak of ages when gods were closer, when humans lived longer, when boundaries were thinner, but closeness is not the same as arrival. It describes intensity of interaction, not origin. This is a crucial distinction. A god can be closer or farther without ever having arrived. Closeness refers to engagement. Arrival refers to entry. The Sumerian texts emphasize changes in engagement, not changes in presence. Over time, gods become more distant. Access becomes restricted. Ritual replaces direct communication. But the gods do not leave in the sense of departing the cosmos. They withdraw within it. The Anunnaki appear precisely at this stage of withdrawal. They are present when the world no longer supports constant divine intervention. They manage what remains. They enforce limits that have become necessary. Placement language fits this role perfectly. They are where they need to be, doing what must be done. This also explains why later cultures struggle to reinterpret them. As centuries passed and the memory of earlier cosmic stages faded, the idea that powerful beings could simply have always been there became less intuitive. Later traditions preferred clearer narratives with beginnings and endings. Arrival filled that need. But the Sumerian texts resist that simplification. They preserve a world view in which power does not need to arrive because it was never absent. What changes is not presence, but accessibility. This perspective also sheds light on why the Anunnaki are often described collectively. They function as a body rather than as individuals. They are counted. They sit together. They decree together. This is not how arrivals are described. It is how institutions are described. Institutions are placed. They are established. They occupy positions within a structure. If the Anunnaki were an institution rather than a visiting group, the language used to describe them suddenly makes sense. Their authority is impersonal. Their actions are procedural. Their judgments are final. They are less like explorers and more like custodians, and custodians do not arrive, they remain. This reading does not require rejecting the symbolic richness of the myths. It requires recognizing what kind of symbolism is being used. The Sumerian imagination was architectural. It thought in terms of layers, foundations, thresholds, and supports. Movement mattered less than position. balance mattered more than origin. In such a system, escape becomes a far more plausible concept than arrival. Escape does not require dramatic motion through space. It requires relocation within an existing structure. It requires withdrawal to a safer, more controllable layer. If something went wrong in an earlier cosmic stage, the response would not necessarily be to abandon the system entirely. It would be to retreat to a position where damage could be managed. The underworld, with its rigid rules and final judgments, fits that role perfectly. The Anunnaki's placement there suggests not conquest but containment, not arrival but consolidation. As we continue, this pattern will repeat. Again and again, the language of the tablets will point us away from dramatic descent and toward quiet positioning, away from beginnings and toward aftermath, away from invasion and toward survival. The words are there. They have always been there. They simply ask us to listen in the way the scribes expected, not the way later imagination prefers. One of the most revealing features of the Sumerian worldview is not simply that gods are associated with specific domains, but that those domains are often described as unstable, contested, or in need of constant supervision. The gods are not portrayed as absolute masters presiding effortlessly over perfectly obedient realms. Instead, they appear as administrators struggling to maintain influence over systems that resist control. Their authority exists, but it is not total. Their power is real, but it's not limitless. This distinction becomes especially important when we look at how the tablets describe divine responsibility. Each god is tied to a function, a region, or a process, yet the texts repeatedly emphasize that these areas require ongoing intervention. Rivers must be managed, winds must be restrained, fertility must be renewed, order must be enforced. If the gods truly ruled domains they fully controlled, none of this would be necessary. Control would be inherent. Instead, we see effort. The language of the tablets reflects this effort quietly but consistently. Gods watch over rather than command absolutely. They ensure rather than guarantee. They restore balance when it is lost. This is maintenance language, not dominion language. It implies that the system has a tendency toward disorder, and that divine authority exists primarily to counteract that tendency. When we place the Anunnaki within this framework, their role becomes even more striking. They are not associated with abundance, creation, or growth. They are associated with limits, with endings, with decisions that cannot be appealed. Their domain, the underworld, is not a place where influence spreads outward. It is a place where movement stops, a realm defined by finality, and yet even here control is not absolute. The underworld in Sumerian thought is not a neatly sealed container. It is porous. Ghosts can rise, dreams carry messages upward, gods can descend and in rare cases return. The Anunnaki preside over this realm, but the texts make it clear that maintaining its boundaries requires constant vigilance. Gates must be guarded, rules must be enforced, transgressions must be punished. This suggests something deeply important. The gods are not rulers of static territories. They are caretakers of unstable thresholds. This instability is not presented as a failure of divine power. It is presented as a condition of the cosmos itself. The universe is not a finished product. It is an ongoing process that resists permanence. The gods exist within this process, not outside it. This becomes clearer when we examine how often the gods complain. In multiple compositions, gods express dissatisfaction with their conditions. They grow tired. They protest labour. They argue among themselves. They even threaten rebellion. These moments are often softened or ritualized in later retellings, but in the earliest layers of the texts they are strikingly candid. Divine existence is burdensome. This burden only makes sense if the gods are maintaining something that no longer runs smoothly on its own. The Anunnaki's association with judgment fits neatly into this picture. Judgment is not creative. It is corrective. It responds to deviation. It exists because control is incomplete. If the system functioned perfectly, judgment would be unnecessary. Even fate, which the Anunnaki are said to decree, is not portrayed as an immutable cosmic script written at the beginning of time. Fate is negotiated. It can be delayed. It can be altered under specific circumstances. Appeals can be made. Cleverness can intervene. This flexibility implies that authority is distributed, contested, and dynamic. The gods define domains, but those domains push back. This pushback is not limited to the natural world. Humanity itself becomes a source of resistance. Humans multiply beyond expectation. They make noise. They disrupt divine rest. They require regulation. Their existence creates problems the gods did not fully anticipate. The response to this is not to abolish humanity entirely, but to impose limits. Lifespans are shortened. Mortality becomes fixed. Population control mechanisms are introduced. Disease, infertility, and death become structural features of human life. These are not acts of conquest. They are acts of containment. Containment implies that something has exceeded its original boundaries. The same logic applies to the gods themselves. The need to assign domains suggests that divine presence cannot be everywhere at once. Specialization becomes necessary. One god oversees water, another oversees wind, another oversees fertility, another oversees death. This division of labor implies constraint. It implies that no single entity holds total control. The Anunnaki, as a collective, oversee the most constrained domain of all, the realm where movement ends, the place where outcomes are fixed. Their authority exists precisely because freedom elsewhere has become problematic. If we view this through the lens of escape rather than arrival, the picture becomes clearer. A system under strain does not expand its power. It fragments it. It delegates. It isolates its most dangerous processes. It concentrates authority where it can still be exercised effectively. The underworld is such a concentration. The Anunnaki's role there suggests that they are not triumphant rulers stepping into a new world, but figures positioned where control is still possible, where ambiguity can be eliminated, where resistance can be neutralized. This interpretation also explains why the gods' domains are so rigidly defined. Rigidity is a response to instability. When flexibility leads to chaos, rules become strict, boundaries become enforced, exceptions become rare. The Anunnaki embody this rigidity. Their judgments are final. Their decrees are binding. They are feared not because they create, but because they conclude. And yet, even they are not beyond limitation. Stories like Inanna's descent show that even the Anunnaki can be challenged indirectly. Cleverness can bypass them. Negotiation can soften their decrees. External intervention can undo their judgments. This does not undermine their authority. It contextualizes it. Their power exists within a system that has already accepted imperfection. This is not the mythology of gods who have just arrived, confident and omnipotent. It is the mythology of gods managing decline. Decline here does not mean collapse. It means movement away from an earlier state of direct divine human integration. The world becomes more mediated. Access becomes ritualized. Authority becomes bureaucratic. The Anunnaki are administrators in this bureaucracy. Administrators arise when systems grow too complex to be governed informally. This is why the gods are defined by domains they do not fully control. Full control would eliminate the need for administration. The very existence of the Anunnaki as a distinct group implies that something has already slipped beyond the reach of earlier, more immediate forms of divine presence. Seen this way, the Anunnaki are not evidence of a beginning. They are evidence of a turning point. They mark the moment when the cosmos can no longer sustain unrestricted interaction between realms, when separation becomes necessary, when limits replace openness. Their authority is real, but it is reactive. It responds to conditions that already exist. It is shaped by constraint rather than expansion. This perspective aligns perfectly with the broader pattern we have been tracing. The tablets emphasize aftermath over arrival, placement over descent, maintenance over creation, and now control over conquest. The gods define domains because they can no longer afford overlap. Overlap leads to conflict. Conflict leads to instability. Stability becomes the overriding concern. As we move forward, we will see this logic applied not just to divine authority, but to sacred space itself. Temples, cities, and rituals will begin to appear not as celebrations of presence, but as structures designed to hold something in place, something that left uncontained might not remain manageable at all. When modern eyes look at ancient temples, it is almost instinctive to imagine them as places of celebration. Spaces built to honour gods, to welcome divine presence, to draw power closer to the human world. Light, incense, music, offerings, ritual movement. All of it seems to point toward attraction, toward invitation, toward drawing something sacred down into stone and brick. But when we read the Sumerian tablets closely, when we pay attention to how temples are described, rather than how we assume they functioned, a very different picture begins to form. Temples in Sumerian thought were not primarily built to invite the gods in. They were built to keep something in place. This difference changes almost everything. The earliest texts do not describe temples as spontaneous expressions of devotion. They describe them as necessary structures, as anchors, as fixed points in a world that would otherwise drift. Gods are said to reside in temples, but this residence is not portrayed as casual or symbolic. It is contractual. It is regulated. It comes with obligations on both sides. Offerings must be made on schedule. Rituals must be performed correctly. Silence must be observed at the right times. Noise, significantly, must be controlled. Noise is one of the most revealing clues to the true function of temples. In multiple texts, divine displeasure is associated not with moral failure but with disturbance. Humanity becomes problematic because it is loud. Cities become dangerous because they generate constant activity. Even successful civilization carries a cost, and that cost is sensory overload in a cosmos that values equilibrium. Temples respond to this problem not by amplifying celebration, but by channeling it. A temple concentrates sound, movement, offering, and attention into a single, regulated space. Instead of gods being confronted by the full chaos of human life, they are approached through ritual filters. Chant replaces clamour. Scheduled offerings replace constant demand. Sacred space replaces uncontrolled proximity. In other words, temples limit access. This is not how one treats a newly arrived god eager to be worshipped. It is how one manages a presence that is already powerful, already dangerous, and no longer meant to roam freely. The Sumerian tablets never describe temples as inventions born from joy. They are born from necessity. They are constructed after order has been established, after cities have formed, after problems have arisen. A temple stabilizes a relationship that has become strained. This becomes clearer when we examine where temples are placed. They are not scattered randomly across the landscape. They occupy specific locations believed to be cosmically significant, points where heaven, earth, and the underworld intersect, places where boundaries are thin. These are not neutral sites, they are fault lines. Building a temple on such a fault line is not an act of celebration, it is an act of containment. The god associated with a temple is not simply honoured there, the god is fixed there, their presence is localised, their influence is made predictable. Ritual is the price paid for stability. This containment logic becomes unmistakable when we look at how temples are described in relation to divine movement. Gods do not wander freely through cities in the texts. They are enthroned, they are housed, they are served. Processions occur, yes, but even these are carefully regulated, temporary and reversible. The god returns to the temple. Always. A god who leaves their temple permanently is not celebrated. it is a crisis. The Anunnaki in particular are never associated with temples as places of joy or abundance. Their presence is felt through judgment, decree, and finality. They are invoked in contexts of law, oath, and consequence. When temples are connected to them, the emphasis is on authority and enforcement, not communion. This suggests that temples serve a dual purpose. For some gods, they provide a point of access. For others, they provide a point of confinement. The Sumerian worldview did not assume that divine presence was universally beneficial. Gods could bring fertility, but they could also bring plague. They could protect, but they could also destroy. Proximity amplified both effects. Containment became essential. This also explains why temples are described with such precision. Measurements matter, orientation matters, materials matter, ritual purity matters. These are not aesthetic concerns, they are safety concerns. When something powerful must be contained, precision becomes survival. The tablets describe temples as places where divine energy is managed, not unleashed. Offerings are not bribes or gifts. They are stabilizers. They maintain the balance of exchange. They ensure that gods receive what they require so that they do not take more than intended. This transactional nature of worship is often misunderstood by later traditions that frame devotion as purely emotional or moral. In Sumerian thought, worship was practical. It kept the system running. A god who is not properly served becomes dangerous. A god whose temple falls into disrepair withdraws protection, or worse, expresses displeasure. Seen in this light, temples look less like places of celebration and more like pressure valves. They absorb the force of divine presence so it does not spill uncontrolled into the wider world. This containment logic fits perfectly with the broader pattern we have been tracing. A world already ordered, gods defined by constrained domains, authority exercised through limits rather than expansion. The Anunnaki emerge within this framework not as honoured guests, but as forces that must be handled carefully. The underworld itself functions like a cosmic temple. It is structured, gated, ruled by fixed procedures. Entry is regulated, exit is nearly impossible. The Anunnaki preside there not because it is glorious, but because it is contained. Temples on Earth mirror this structure. They are microcosms of cosmic containment. They enforce boundaries between sacred and profane, divine and human, order and chaos. The language used in the tablets reinforces this interpretation. Temples are established. They are secured. They are maintained. They are restored after damage. Rarely are they celebrated. Rarely are they described as spontaneous expressions of joy. Even temple festivals, which might seem celebratory on the surface, follow strict calendars and rules. They release pressure in controlled bursts. They prevent build-up. They reset equilibrium. If we return to the idea that the Anunnaki did not arrive but escaped, temples take on an even deeper significance. An escaped force is not welcomed openly. It is contained, monitored, and negotiated with. It is given a place, not freedom. The gods of earlier cosmic stages may have interacted directly with humanity. They may have walked closer, but by the time the Anunnaki become prominent, that closeness has become unsustainable. Temples formalize distance. This distance is not abandonment, it is survival. The tablets show a gradual shift from direct divine involvement to mediated presence. Dreams replace appearances, omens replace speech, priests replace messengers, temples replace open interaction. This is the architecture of retreat. And retreat does not require travel from elsewhere. It requires reorganization within the same world. Temples, then, are not monuments to arrival. They are monuments to adjustment, to compromise, to a relationship that can no longer function as it once did. This interpretation also explains why temples are often described as houses rather than meeting halls. A house is where one stays, where one is kept, where one belongs, whether willingly or not. The gods dwell in temples because they are meant to remain there, and when temples fall, When they are destroyed or abandoned, the texts describe this not as liberation, but as disaster. Divine presence becomes unmoored, protection is lost, chaos follows. This reaction only makes sense if the temple's role was containment. Removing a container does not free something harmless. It releases something unstable. The Anunnaki's association with judgment and finality makes their relationship to temples particularly revealing. They do not require celebration, they require enforcement. Their presence does not bring abundance, it brings closure. Temples ensure that closure happens in the right place, under the right conditions. As we continue, we'll see how this logic extends beyond sacred architecture into language itself, how words, names and titles become tools of containment, how naming fixes what movement would otherwise destabilize. The world of the tablets is not one rushing forward into new beginnings, it is one learning how to live with what remains. When movement does appear in the Sumerian tablets, it is almost never framed as travel in the way modern readers instinctively imagine it. There are no journeys undertaken for discovery, no explorations into the unknown, no narratives built around crossing vast distances to reach new lands. Instead, movement is consistently described as withdrawal, as removal, as a stepping back from direct involvement. What changes is not location in the geographic sense, but degree of presence. This is one of the most quietly revealing features of the texts, because it runs directly counter to later interpretations that rely on images of gods moving from place to place, arriving from elsewhere, departing to distant realms. The Sumerian language does not support that picture. It supports something far more restrained and far more structural. When a god goes, the tablets rarely specify where they go in spatial terms. There is no emphasis on distance travelled or obstacles crossed. Instead, the emphasis falls on what no longer happens afterward. Direct speech ceases, physical presence diminishes, interaction becomes mediated. Authority remains, but access does not. This is not travel, this is retreat. The clearest example of this pattern appears in moments when divine-human interaction changes form. Early texts describe gods acting directly. They speak, they intervene, they appear. Later texts describe gods acting indirectly. They send signs, they send dreams, they issue decrees through priests. The change is not described as gods leaving the world. It is described as gods no longer being immediately present within it. The tablets never say the gods went somewhere else, in the sense of relocating to a different planet or realm outside the cosmos. They say the gods withdrew, they became distant, they ceased to walk among humans. The world remains the same. What changes is accessibility. This distinction matters deeply when considering the Anunnaki. If they had arrived through travel, we would expect the texts to describe motion. Instead, their appearance coincides with an already established pattern of withdrawal by other gods. They step into prominence precisely as direct divine presence elsewhere diminishes. In this sense, their rise is not the result of arrival, but of vacancy. The Sumerian worldview does not imagine the cosmos as an open system, with new entries coming and going freely. It imagines a closed structure with layers of engagement. Gods can be closer or farther, more involved or less, but they do not come from outside the structure. They reposition within it. This is why movement is described relationally rather than spatially. A god is said to turn away from a city, to withhold favour, to remove protection. These are movements of attention and authority, not of bodies. When a city falls, the text does not say the god left physically, it says the god abandoned the city. The consequence is the same, but the framing is crucial. Abandonment implies prior presence, and prior presence implies that no arrival was necessary. The flood narratives make this especially clear. When the gods decide to destroy humanity, they do not travel to do so, they decree. The destruction unfolds through natural forces already embedded in the world. Water rises, storms gather, The gods are not depicted as flying across the sky to unleash catastrophe. Their action is administrative. After the flood, when the gods regret their decision, they do not journey to retrieve humanity. They negotiate. They adjust conditions. They impose limits. Again, movement is internal to the system. Even Enki's intervention on behalf of Ziusudra does not involve travel. He does not appear openly. He speaks through a wall, through a dream, through indirect means that technically avoid violating divine law. His cleverness lies in staying within bounds, not crossing them. This emphasis on indirectness is not incidental. It reflects a world in which direct movement has become risky. Boundaries matter. Crossing them has consequences. The more ordered the cosmos becomes, the more dangerous unregulated movement grows. The underworld illustrates this perfectly. Entry is easy, exit is not. Once something crosses into that domain, it does not travel back freely. That is the point. The Anunnaki preside over this finality. Their authority exists because movement must stop somewhere. If the cosmos allowed endless travel, endless return, endless circulation, it would never stabilize. The Sumerians understood this intuitively. Their own environment taught them. Rivers that overflow must recede. Fields that flood must dry. Life that multiplies must end. Movement must be checked. The gods themselves are subject to this logic. Inanna's descent is catastrophic precisely because it violates expected withdrawal patterns. She does not withdraw gradually. She descends deliberately. She crosses gates. She sheds power. She dies. The myth dramatizes this because it is exceptional. It is not the norm. If gods routinely traveled between realms, this story wouldn't carry such weight. Instead, it underscores that movement is dangerous when it crosses boundaries directly. Withdrawal is safer. It preserves structure. It maintains order. This helps explain why later Sumerian texts are filled with laments. Gods withdraw from cities. Favor is removed. Protection is lifted. These laments mourn absence, not departure. The gods are still part of the cosmos. They are simply no longer accessible in the same way. This is the emotional register of aftermath. The Anunnaki fit seamlessly into this register. They are not described as having come from somewhere else. They are described as occupying the spaces left behind when other forms of divine engagement recede. They manage what remains when movement inward becomes the only viable option. Seen through this lens, escape does not mean fleeing to another place. It means withdrawing from a level of engagement that has become unsustainable. It means stepping back into a more controlled position within the same structure. The Anunnaki's association with judgment, fate, and the underworld suggests exactly this kind of repositioning. They preside over outcomes, not processes. They finalize what has already unfolded. They do not wander. This is why their movement is never described as a journey. They are already where they need to be. The tablets reinforce this by focusing on the consequences of divine withdrawal rather than its mechanics. Cities fall because gods abandon them. Crops fail because favor is removed. Kings lose legitimacy because divine backing is withdrawn. These are the stories that matter. If arrival were central to the Sumerian understanding of divine action, we would see the opposite emphasis. We would see descriptions of gods entering cities, choosing lands, establishing themselves. Instead, we see gods leaving, withholding, retreating. This directional bias is unmistakable. It also explains why later cultures struggle to reinterpret Sumerian mythology. As the memory of early cosmic stages faded, withdrawal became harder to conceptualize. It was easier to imagine gods arriving than to imagine gods pulling back from a world that once knew them more closely. But the tablets preserve the older perspective. They show a cosmos that began with proximity and moved toward distance, a system that started with openness and moved toward containment. Movement, in this worldview, is not about exploration. It is about regulation. The Anunnaki's prominence emerges precisely when regulation becomes necessary. They do not explore new territories. They enforce existing boundaries. They do not travel outward. They preside inward. This reading also aligns with how names function in the texts. Naming fixes position. Once something is named, it becomes anchored. The Anunnaki are named when their function becomes stable, not when they appear. Naming is a form of containment. As the narrative continues, this theme will deepen. We will see how absence becomes normalized, how return is no longer expected, how the gods themselves become part of memory rather than experience. Movement slows, distance increases, the system adapts, and within that adaptation the Anunnaki are not arrivals at all. They are the ones who remain when movement can no longer be afforded. One of the most telling features of the Sumerian tablets is not what they say about gods leaving, withdrawing or becoming distant, but what they never say afterward. Once a god recedes, once direct presence fades, the texts do not wait for a return. They do not build anticipation. They do not promise restoration. There is no narrative arc that bends back toward reunion. This silence itself becomes structural. In later religious traditions, absence is almost always temporary. A god departs, but only to come back stronger. A saviour leaves, but promises return. Distance becomes a test of faith rather than a permanent condition. This expectation is so deeply embedded in modern thinking that its absence in the Sumerian worldview feels almost unsettling once noticed. The tablets simply do not behave this way. When divine presence diminishes in the Sumerian texts, it diminishes without ceremony. It does not demand explanation, reassurance, or hope. It becomes part of the new normal. The world adjusts, ritual changes, authority reorganizes, life continues under altered conditions. This is not neglect, it is acceptance. The flood narratives offer the clearest example. After the catastrophe ends, after humanity survives in reduced form, after new limits are imposed on lifespan and fertility, the gods do not promise to return to their earlier level of involvement. There is no statement that the age of close divine human contact will resume. The boundary remains, mortality stays fixed, distance persists. The moment passes and it does not circle back. Even Ziusudra's reward reflects this logic. He is not restored to human society as a living bridge between eras. He is removed from it entirely, placed in Dilmun beyond ordinary human reach. The memory of the old world is preserved, but it is sealed away. The past is acknowledged, not revived. This pattern repeats across the corpus. Gods withdraw from cities that offend them. Laments are composed. The destruction is mourned. But when the city is rebuilt, the god does not always return in the same way. Sometimes the name remains, but the intimacy does not. Protection becomes conditional. Access becomes mediated. What is missing is the expectation that things will return to how they were. The absence of return narratives suggests that the Sumerians did not imagine history as cyclical, in the comforting sense. There are cycles of season and agriculture, yes, but not cycles of divine proximity. Time moves forward through loss as well as gain. Some thresholds, once crossed, remain behind. This has profound implications for how we understand the Anunnaki. If the Anunnaki were arrivals, we would expect departure narratives to matter. We would expect questions about when they would leave, where they would go, or whether they would come back. Instead, the texts are unconcerned with these questions. The Anunnaki appear, function, and remain associated with fixed roles. There is no anticipation of their return because there is no sense that they left. Likewise, there is no story about earlier gods returning to reclaim what they withdrew from. The primordial closeness is not restored. The age before limits does not come back. The tablets treat that era as finished. This finality is reinforced linguistically. Verbs associated with withdrawal are perfective. They describe completed actions. A god has turned away. Favour has been removed. Kingship has ended. These are not ongoing processes awaiting reversal. They are settled states. The emotional tone of the texts reflects this as well. Laments grieve what is lost, but they do not expect its return. They plead for mercy, for mitigation, for survival, not for restoration of an earlier cosmic arrangement. Hope is pragmatic, not nostalgic. This is crucial. A culture that expects return frames absence differently. It interprets distance as temporary. It preserves structures for reunion. The Sumerians did not do this. They restructured their world around permanence of loss. Temples became mediating structures precisely because direct presence was no longer expected. Priests replaced gods in daily governance. Omens replaced conversation. Writing replaced memory. These are adaptations, not placeholders. Adaptation implies permanence. The Anunnaki fit seamlessly into this adapted world. They are not figures awaited or anticipated. They are not transitional. They are stable. Their authority does not promise renewal. It enforces boundaries that will not be undone. The underworld, their primary domain, has no return narrative by design. Entry is one way. Death is final. Even gods who descend do so at great cost and rarely return unchanged. The system does not expect reversibility. This irreversibility mirrors the broader cosmic condition. Once the world moves away from direct divine-human integration, it does not return. The gods do not walk back into cities. Humanity does not regain extended lifespans. The noise problem is not solved by reconciliation. It is solved by limitation. In such a worldview, escape makes more sense than arrival. Escape is a one-way movement. It does not anticipate return. It seeks survival within constraints. If something escaped from an earlier cosmic state, the system would not wait for it to come back. It would reorganize around its absence. The Sumerian tablets read exactly like records of such reorganization. This also explains why later traditions struggled to reinterpret these texts. Cultures that came after the Sumerians increasingly favored narratives of return. Redemption arcs, restored paradises, final judgments followed by renewal. These ideas are largely absent in the earliest layers. The Sumerian imagination was more austere. What was lost was lost. What remained had to be managed. The Anunnaki are managers, not messengers of hope. They do not promise restoration. They do not reopen closed doors. They preside over finality. And crucially, no text anticipates their disappearance either. They are not temporary caretakers. They are part of the settled order. Once they are named, they are assumed. This quiet absence of return narratives tells us that the tablets are not describing a drama still in motion. They are describing a world that has already crossed its most significant threshold. The story is not unfolding toward reunion. It is stabilizing after separation. As we continue, this absence will echo in subtler ways, in how power is inherited rather than introduced, in how memory replaces experience, in how authority persists without presence. The silence around return is not a gap in the record. It is one of its clearest signals. Something left, something did not come back, and the world learned how to continue without expecting it to. When the Sumerian tablets speak about power, they do so in a way that feels almost alien to modern instincts. Power is not seized. It is not taken by force from an unwilling world. It is not imposed from the outside. Instead, power descends once, settles into structure, and then moves forward through inheritance. Authority passes from one holder to the next, not as conquest, but as continuation. This framing is consistent across divine and human realms. Kingship does not emerge through rebellion or invasion. It descends. Once it has descended, it is transmitted. A king rules because he inherits a position that already exists. When that position is lost, it is lost through divine withdrawal, not overthrow. The system itself remains intact even as individual rulers change. This same logic governs the gods. The Anunnaki do not appear as invaders disrupting an existing order. They appear as heirs operating within one. Their authority is never described as something they fought for or imposed. It is described as something they possess by lineage and placement. Their power flows downward through established channels rather than outward through expansion. This distinction matters because invasion narratives require resistance. They require displacement. They require a before and after that is marked clearly by conflict. The Sumerian tablets do not present such a rupture. There is no text that describes the Anunnaki replacing earlier gods through force. There is no record of battles for control of heaven or earth involving them. No cosmic war that installs them as new rulers. Instead, what we see is succession. Earlier gods establish structure. Later gods inherit responsibility. Domains become specialized. Authority becomes distributed. This is not the story of outsiders arriving to take control. It is the story of insiders adapting to a changing system. Inheritance language dominates this process. Gods are children of gods. Authority is passed through descent. Even judgment is framed as the continuation of an established role, rather than the assertion of a new one. The Anunnaki judge because judgment must occur, not because they have claimed the right to do so. This is especially clear in how the tablets handle legitimacy. Legitimacy does not come from power alone. It comes from recognition within the system. A god's authority is valid because it is acknowledged by other gods. A king's authority is valid because it is sanctioned by the divine assembly. Invasion would undermine this logic. It would require the system to revalidate itself after disruption. The tablets show no interest in such revalidation. Instead, they assume continuity even through catastrophe. The flood does not abolish kingship. It suspends it. Afterward, kingship resumes. The structure survives. Only its parameters change. Lifespans shorten. Access narrows. Authority becomes more conditional, but the framework remains. The Anunnaki are woven into this surviving framework. They do not stand outside it. This inheritance-based model of power also explains why the Anunnaki are often portrayed collectively rather than individually. Inherited authority is institutional. It does not depend on personal charisma or conquest. It depends on role. The Anunnaki function as a body because their power is systemic, not personal. Institutions do not invade. They persist. This perspective casts doubt on interpretations that rely on the imagery of advanced beings arriving to reshape humanity. Such narratives depend on disruption. They require a clear point of entry where power shifts dramatically. The Sumerian texts offer no such moment. Power shifts gradually, through reassignment and limitation, not through replacement. Even humanity's creation fits this pattern. Humans are not conquered. They are introduced into a labour system that already exists. Their role is defined in relation to divine needs that have already been identified. Humanity is not invaded by gods. Humanity is integrated. Integration is the opposite of invasion. The Anunnaki's role within this integrated system is consistent. They oversee outcomes that arise naturally from the system's operation. Death, fate, judgment. These are not foreign impositions. They are necessary functions once complexity reaches a certain level. A simple world does not need judges. A complex one does. This complexity also explains why power becomes increasingly abstract in later texts. Early gods act directly. Later gods act through law, ritual, and decree. Power moves away from physical presence and toward institutional authority. The Anunnaki embody this shift. They do not walk the land reshaping it. They sit in judgment, determining what must stand and what must end. This is inherited power refined into procedure. Procedure is never invasive. It operates quietly, predictably, and impersonally. The language of the tablets reinforces this impersonality. Decrees are issued. Fates are fixed. Outcomes are sealed. Rarely do we see emotional motivation attached to these acts. The Anunnaki do not rage. They do not desire. They do not seek. They enforce. Enforcement implies existing rules. This is why the Anunnaki feel so different from earlier gods associated with fertility, storms, or creativity. Those gods interact with the world dynamically. The Anunnaki interact with it conclusively. Their authority marks the end of processes, not the beginning. If they were invaders, we would expect their power to expand outward, to claim new domains, to reshape the world aggressively. Instead, their influence is inward. It narrows possibilities, it fixes outcomes, it reduces movement. This inward motion aligns perfectly with the idea of escape. Escape is not expansion. It is consolidation. It seeks safety within boundaries, not dominance over new territory. If an earlier cosmic order became unstable, the response would not necessarily be to conquer something new. It would be to preserve what could still be controlled. Authority would be concentrated. Roles would be defined. Movement would be limited. Inheritance accomplishes this. It allows power to persist without disruption. The Anunnaki inherit responsibility in a world that has already lost something. They do not announce a new era. They stabilize a diminished one. This is why the tablets do not celebrate their appearance. There is no triumph, no victory, no new beginning. Their presence is treated as normal, even somber. They belong to a phase of history where management has replaced creation. Later traditions, uncomfortable with this austerity, reimagine them as conquerors or visitors. Invasion is easier to dramatize than inheritance. It gives power a visible cause. It simplifies complexity into conflict. But the Sumerian record resists that simplification. It preserves a subtler, heavier truth. Power does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it settles quietly into the hands of those who remain when others have withdrawn. And when power is inherited rather than seized, it tells us something crucial about the past it came from. It suggests continuity through loss, not domination through arrival. As we move forward, this inherited authority will reveal another layer of meaning. We will see how the Anunnaki's power is exercised not through presence, but through what they leave behind. How administration replaces interaction. How survival replaces expansion. The story continues, not with invasion, but with what follows when invasion never occurred. By the time the Anunnaki take on clear definition in the Sumerian record, the world no longer needs builders, it needs caretakers. The structures that matter most have already been established. Heaven and earth are separated, cities exist, humanity performs its function, ritual calendars run, kingship operates. What remains is not creation, but continuity. And continuity, especially in a system that has already begun to strain, requires administration. This is where the Anunnaki belong. They are not introduced as visionaries or innovators. They do not bring new tools, new knowledge, or new forms of life into the world. They do not expand the cosmos. They regulate it. Their authority appears precisely at the point where regulation becomes unavoidable. Administration is never glamorous. It does not announce itself with spectacle. It does not inspire awe through novelty. It exists because systems have grown too complex, too populated, too noisy to function without oversight. The Anunnaki emerge at exactly this stage. The Sumerian tablets describe a cosmos that has moved beyond its formative phase. The early gods establish patterns, but those patterns generate consequences. Humanity multiplies, labour becomes burdensome, balance falters, noise disrupts divine rest. These are not failures of design. They are the natural outcomes of a system that has succeeded too well. The response is not to abandon the system, but to manage it more tightly. The Anunnaki's roles reflect this shift. They do not govern the growth of crops or the flow of rivers. They do not preside over fertility or weather. Those functions belong to gods whose authority operates through abundance and renewal. The Anunnaki preside over judgment, fate, and the underworld. These are not generative domains. They are corrective ones. Correction only becomes necessary when a process has already run its course. The tablets repeatedly associate the Anunnaki with finality. Decisions they participate in are not provisional. They are binding. When fate is fixed, it is not reopened for debate. When judgment is rendered, it concludes a matter rather than beginning one. This is the language of administration, not authorship. Administrative authority exists to preserve what still functions by limiting what does not. This perspective also explains why the Anunnaki are often portrayed as a collective rather than as distinct personalities. Administrators act as bodies, councils deliberate, judges sit together. Responsibility is shared because it is systemic. The Anunnaki do not need individual mythic arcs because their power does not depend on individuality. It depends on position. Position is everything. The underworld, which becomes their primary sphere, is itself an administrative construct. It is not chaotic. It is ordered. It has gates, rules, procedures. Outcomes are standardized. Everyone who enters experiences the same condition regardless of status. Kings, priests, and commoners alike become shadows. Equality in death is not moral commentary. It is administrative efficiency. A system that has reached this point is no longer experimenting, it is enforcing. This enforcement does not imply cruelty, it implies necessity. The Sumerian worldview does not frame judgment as punishment in a moral sense. It frames it as closure. Life produces outcomes. Those outcomes must be resolved. The Anunnaki exist to ensure resolution occurs cleanly. If we return to the idea of escape, the Anunnaki's administrative role takes on deeper meaning. Escape does not mean abandoning responsibility. It means relocating responsibility to a position where it can still be exercised. If an earlier cosmic order became unstable, the most powerful beings would not necessarily leave the system entirely. They would retreat to its most controllable layer. Administration is control after withdrawal. The Anunnaki do not need to create because creation has already happened. They do not need to conquer because there is nothing left to take. What they oversee is what remains after expansion has stopped. This is why the tablets never describe them introducing new laws. Laws already exist. They enforce them. They do not invent mortality. They regulate it. They do not initiate the separation between divine and human realms. They manage the consequences of that separation. The gods who act earlier in the mythic timeline are associated with beginnings. The Anunnaki are associated with endings. Endings require management more than inspiration. This also explains why the Anunnaki rarely intervene directly in the living world. Their authority is invoked, not enacted physically. They are called upon in oaths. They are named in curses. They are referenced in rituals dealing with death and fate. Their power operates through acknowledgement, not appearance. An administrator does not need to be seen to be effective. The Sumerian scribes understood this well. Their own world was administered by systems that relied on record-keeping, lists, seals, and standardized procedures. Power flowed through documentation rather than force. The Anunnaki mirror this structure at a cosmic level. They are the scribes of fate. This parallel is not accidental. Sumerian civilization was built on bureaucracy. Writing emerged to manage surplus, labor, and obligation. As the human world became more administratively complex, so too did the divine world. The Anunnaki reflect a projection of this reality upward. A cosmos that requires writing is already beyond simplicity. If the Anunnaki were arrivals, we would expect them to disrupt this system. We would expect a shift in administration, a replacement of procedures, a new logic imposed from outside. Instead, what we see is refinement, greater emphasis on finality, clearer boundaries, more rigid enforcement. Refinement suggests internal adjustment, not external intrusion. This internal adjustment also explains why the Anunnaki are often feared rather than loved. Administrative power is rarely affectionate. It does not seek devotion. It seeks compliance. The Anunnaki do not grant blessings, they determine outcomes. Blessings belong to gods of growth. Outcomes belong to gods of closure. The Sumerian worldview does not treat this as tragic. It treats it as inevitable. Every system that grows eventually reaches a point where management replaces creation. The Anunnaki are the divine expression of that moment. Their presence signals that the world has matured beyond openness, that possibilities must now be narrowed, that not everything can continue indefinitely. This narrowing is not framed as failure, it is framed as order. Seen this way, the Anunnaki are not anomalies in the Sumerian pantheon. They are its logical conclusion. They arise when the cosmos no longer needs to be made, only maintained, and maintenance, at a certain scale, always requires administration. As we move further, we will begin to see how this administrative logic reshapes the very idea of power itself, how authority becomes quieter, more distant and more absolute at the same time, how the gods no longer walk among humans but still govern their destinies. What remains is not the world of beginnings, it is the world after beginnings have ended. When the Anunnaki appear in the Sumerian texts, the moments that surround their presence are not scenes of expansion, discovery, or domination. They are scenes of judgment. Decisions are made, fates are fixed, boundaries are enforced, something is brought to an end, not brought under control through force. This distinction is not subtle once it is recognized, and it sharply separates the Sumerian record from later interpretations that rely on conquest as their central theme. Conquest requires opposition. It assumes resistance, struggle, and the replacement of one authority by another. It demands narrative energy. Battles must be described. Victories must be claimed. Losses must be recorded. None of this appears in the texts associated with the Anunnaki. There are no wars attributed to them, no campaigns, no territories seized, no enemies defeated. Their authority is never framed as something earned through violence. Instead, it is assumed. Judgment does not need to conquer. It presupposes legitimacy. A judge does not seize authority from those who appear before them. Authority is already recognized, already embedded in the system. The role of the judge is to interpret, not to overthrow. This is exactly how the Anunnaki function. They appear at moments where outcomes must be decided, not where power must be established. They sit, they decree, they determine. The language is procedural rather than dramatic. There is no rush, no urgency, no sense that their authority is fragile or contested. It is stable because it is systemic. The most famous appearance of the Anunnaki occurs in narratives connected to the underworld. There, they act as judges of the dead. This setting alone eliminates the possibility of conquest. The dead do not resist. They do not fight back. Judgment here is final precisely because conquest is no longer possible. If the Anunnaki were conquerors, their stories would unfold among the living. Power is tested in the world of action, but the Anunnaki preside where action has ended. This is not accidental. The Sumerians understood that true authority does not always operate through force. In fact, force is often a sign of instability. Stable systems rely on recognition, not coercion. The Anunnaki's power is recognized automatically by gods and humans alike. No one challenges their right to judge. No one questions their decrees. Even powerful gods submit to their decisions. This submission tells us more than any dramatic battle scene could. It reveals that the Anunnaki are embedded within the deepest layer of cosmic order. They are not competing for dominance. They are enforcing the rules that dominance itself must obey. The absence of conquest language is also evident in how the tablets describe cosmic change. When catastrophes occur, such as the flood, they are not framed as acts of domination over humanity. They are framed as corrections. Excess is reduced. Noise is silenced. Balance is restored. The motivation is not victory, it is regulation. Judgment language fits this perfectly. The gods deliberate. Complaints are raised. Decisions are reached. Outcomes follow. Even when destruction is immense, it is justified in terms of necessity rather than triumph. The Anunnaki are associated with the final stages of these processes, where debate ends and consequences begin. This framing also explains why the Anunnaki are never described as heroic. Heroes conquer, heroes struggle, heroes overcome opposition. The Anunnaki do none of these things. They are not admired. They are feared, not because they attack, but because they conclude. Conclusion is more frightening than conquest. Conquest can be resisted. Conclusion cannot. The Sumerian texts are acutely aware of this distinction. They treat judgment with solemnity, not excitement. The tone becomes heavy, restrained, and final. When the Anunnaki are invoked, something irreversible is about to occur. This tone would make little sense if the Anunnaki were invaders. Invasion is chaotic. It creates uncertainty. Judgment resolves uncertainty. The fact that the text emphasize resolution over struggle strongly suggests that the Anunnaki are not agents of change, but agents of closure. They do not reshape the world. They decide what remains within it. This is also why their power feels distant rather than immediate. Conquest requires presence. Armies must appear, forces must move. Judgment requires acknowledgement. It can be exercised from stillness. The Anunnaki do not need to be seen to act. This invisible authority mirrors how Sumerian society itself functioned. Law was not enforced through constant violence. It was enforced through recognition of legitimacy. Contracts, oaths, and seals mattered because people accepted their binding nature. The Anunnaki embody this legal logic at a cosmic scale. They are the guarantors of consequence. If we return again to the idea of escape rather than arrival, the emphasis on judgment becomes even more revealing. A system that has escaped from a prior instability would prioritize containment over expansion. It would need mechanisms to prevent recurrence. Judgment is such a mechanism. It closes loops. It ends processes before they spiral out of control. Conquest opens new loops. It introduces new variables. It destabilizes. The Sumerian cosmos, as reflected in the tablets, is no longer interested in destabilization. It has learned the cost. The Anunnaki represent the system's answer to that lesson. They are not conquerors because conquest belongs to an earlier phase, when boundaries were still fluid. By the time the Anunnaki take prominence, boundaries have hardened. The work now is to enforce them. This also explains why later interpreters struggle to reconcile the Anunnaki with more familiar mythic archetypes. Conquerors are easy to understand, judges are not. Judges require a system. They require context. They require restraint. The Sumerian texts offer that context, but only if we read them patiently. They do not tell us that the Anunnaki came to rule the world. They show us a world that already needs ruling. They do not describe how authority was seized. They assume authority has already been established. What matters is how it is exercised, and it is exercised through judgment. This focus reshapes how we understand power in the Sumerian imagination. Power is not the ability to act without limit. It is the ability to decide when action must stop. It is the authority to say no more. The Anunnaki speak with that authority. They are not warriors standing at the beginning of history. They are arbiters standing at its thresholds. They appear not where something begins, but where something must end. As we continue, this emphasis on judgment will deepen into something even more striking. We will see how the Anunnaki's authority becomes increasingly tied to spaces where life itself is concluded, and how the underworld shifts from a distant realm into a central organizing principle of the cosmos. What emerges is not a story of conquest, but of control after expansion has already run its course. By the time the Anunnaki become firmly established in the Sumerian imagination, the underworld is no longer a distant or marginal concept. It moves to the center of the cosmological system, not as a place of fascination, but as a place of necessity. This shift is quiet, almost administrative in tone. yet it marks one of the most profound transformations in how the world is understood to function. In earlier phases of Sumerian thought, attention is focused upward and outward. Heaven matters because it organizes time. Earth matters because it sustains life. Water matters because it enables survival. These domains are active, productive, and visible. But as the system matures, as complexity increases and pressure accumulates, attention begins to turn downward instead, toward where things end, toward where excess must go. The rise of the underworld is not dramatic. It is not announced as a revelation. It simply becomes more present in the texts, more referenced, more structurally important. This gradual centralization tells us something essential. The world has reached a point where beginnings alone can no longer sustain it. Endings must be managed with equal care. The Anunnaki's association with the underworld is inseparable from this development. They do not introduce the underworld, it already exists. But once they appear by name, the underworld becomes organized, procedural, and authoritative. It is no longer just the place where the dead go. It becomes the place where outcomes are fixed. This transformation mirrors what happens in any system that has grown too large to regulate itself through informal means. Early on, problems are handled locally. Later, centralized mechanisms are required. The underworld becomes such a mechanism. It absorbs what the living world can no longer process. In Sumerian texts, death is not framed as a moral sorting process. The underworld does not reward or punish based on virtue. It equalizes. Kings, priests, warriors, and laborers all arrive in the same condition. This uniformity is not theological pessimism. It is administrative logic. Equality in death simplifies management. The Anunnaki preside over this simplified domain. Their authority does not depend on moral evaluation, it depends on finality. Once something enters their jurisdiction, it does not circulate back into the system freely. This one-way movement stabilizes the living world by removing excess permanently. This is why the underworld becomes central only after their appearance. A world that does not yet require strict limits does not need such a domain to dominate its imagination. A world under strain does. The tablets repeatedly emphasize that humanity has become too numerous, too noisy, too disruptive. The solution is not conquest or annihilation, but regulation. Death becomes regulated. Lifespans are shortened. Entry into the underworld becomes routine rather than exceptional. Routine death requires infrastructure. The underworld provides that infrastructure, and the Anunnaki are its administrators. This also explains why underworld imagery grows more detailed over time. Gates are counted, judges are named, procedures are described, even food and drink are standardized. These details are not meant to terrify, they are meant to normalize. Normalization of death is a sign of systemic adaptation. Earlier mythologies often treat death as an anomaly, a rupture in the natural order. The Sumerian texts, especially in their later layers, treat it as a constant, something that must be accounted for in planning, ritual, and law. The Anunnaki's prominence reflects this shift. Their power is not over life's beginning, but over life's inevitable conclusion. That conclusion becomes central because the system cannot afford ambiguity about it anymore. This centrality also reshapes the living world. Once the underworld becomes fixed and authoritative, the meaning of action changes. Deeds are no longer judged solely by immediate consequences. They are weighed against final outcomes. Fate becomes something that can be sealed, not endlessly revised. The Anunnaki are invoked in oaths precisely because of this. An oath matters because it has consequences beyond life. Breaking it is not just a social offence, it is a cosmic one, judged where reversal is impossible. This is not the language of a world focused on expansion. It is the language of a world focused on containment. Containment requires endpoints. The underworld provides the ultimate endpoint. The Anunnaki ensure that endpoint functions reliably. Seen through this lens, the underworld is not a gloomy afterthought. It is the keystone of the system. Without it, the living world would collapse under its own accumulation. Population would grow unchecked. Conflict would spiral. Memory would overwhelm. Noise would never end. The underworld silences what cannot be silenced elsewhere. This silence is not framed as cruelty. It is framed as balance. The Anunnaki's authority within this space explains why they are feared but rarely worshipped with affection. They do not give. They take nothing. They conclude. Their presence is acknowledged, not celebrated. If they had arrived as conquerors, their central domain would likely have been the earth or the sky. Power seeks visibility when it wants recognition, but their power is rooted below, out of sight. That placement makes sense only if their function is to stabilize, not to dominate. This reinforces the broader pattern we have been tracing. The Sumerian cosmos is not moving toward greater openness. It is moving toward greater regulation. The underworld becomes central because regulation requires a place where processes stop completely. Escape, in this context, does not mean fleeing upward or outward. It means consolidating downward. It means retreating into a position where control is absolute because choice has ended. The Anunnaki's role fits this perfectly. They are not remnants clinging to the world. They are the custodians of its limits. As we continue, we will see how this centrality of the underworld reshapes the language used to describe authority itself, how even divine power becomes framed in terms of what it can no longer do, rather than what it can still accomplish. The story is no longer about how the world was made. It is about how it is kept from coming apart. If the Sumerian scribes ever intended to describe escape, they did not do so with the language of fear or panic. They did not record frantic departures or desperate flight. Instead, they embedded the idea quietly inside the very grammar of authority. Escape, in their texts, does not announce itself as motion. It disguises itself as permanence. It hides inside titles, roles, and decrees that appear stable on the surface, but only make sense if something has already been left behind. This is why escape is so easy to miss when reading the tablets quickly. We expect escape to look dramatic. We expect urgency, pursuit, danger. But the Sumerian worldview was not cinematic. It was structural. When something became untenable, the response was not spectacle. It was reorganization. The first clue lies in how divine authority is framed after the Anunnaki become prominent. Authority is no longer described as expansive. It does not grow. It does not reach outward. Instead, it hardens. It becomes fixed, procedural, and limited to specific domains. Gods do not gain new powers. They consolidate existing ones. Consolidation is not the behavior of an arriving force. It is the behavior of a force that has retreated to a defensible position. The Anunnaki's authority is repeatedly defined by what it cannot be challenged on. Judgment cannot be appealed. Fate, once fixed, cannot be revised. Death cannot be undone. These are absolute statements. They do not describe power in motion. They describe power that has drawn a line and refuses to cross it again. This absolutism is revealing. Absolute boundaries usually appear when flexibility has already caused harm. Earlier divine authority in the tablets is fluid. Gods negotiate. They argue. They improvise. Enki finds loopholes. Inanna pushes limits. The system bends. But by the time the Anunnaki's role becomes clear, bending has become dangerous. Flexibility has led to excess, noise, imbalance, and catastrophe. The response is not expansion, but lockdown. Escape language appears here as refusal. Refusal to re-engage directly. Refusal to reopen earlier modes of interaction. Refusal to allow return. The Anunnaki do not intervene creatively because creative intervention belongs to an earlier phase that no longer works. Their authority exists to prevent re-entry into that phase. They are guardians not of a place but of a condition where limits are enforced, This is why their power is framed as final rather than active. Finality is the safest form of authority when retreat has already occurred. Another trace of escape language appears in how responsibility is described. The Anunnaki do not claim authorship of the world's problems. They do not take credit for creation. They do not present themselves as originators of humanity or civilization. They inherit responsibility for outcomes, not causes. In administrative systems, this distinction matters. Originators are accountable for design. Administrators are accountable for enforcement. If something went wrong earlier, administrators manage the consequences without revisiting the cause. This separation allows escape without confession. The tablets never describe a moment when gods admit failure in creating the world. Instead, they quietly shift focus to management, to judgment, to containment. The cause of instability fades into the background. What remains is the necessity of control. The Anunnaki embody that necessity. Even their association with fate contains escape language. Fate in the Sumerian sense is not destiny unfolding toward a goal. It is outcome fixed to prevent further deviation. Fate stops movement. It ensures that events do not spiral beyond control. Stopping movement is the goal of escape. If an earlier cosmic order allowed too much movement, too much interaction, too much closeness, then fixing fate becomes the ultimate safeguard. Once fate is sealed, nothing escapes upward again. This is why the Anunnaki are often described as those who decree. Decrees replace dialogue. Once dialogue becomes dangerous, decrees are safer. Dialogue invites unpredictability. Decrees do not. Another quiet indicator lies in how the Anunnaki relate to space. They are not associated with horizons, journeys, or borders expanding. They are associated with thresholds that close, gates that do not reopen, domains that do not leak. The underworld's gates are counted because counting prevents loss. Nothing enters or exits unnoticed. This is administrative thinking born from retreat. A system that feels secure does not count its gates. The tablets also show that divine authority becomes increasingly impersonal over time. Names matter less than roles. Individual personalities blur into collective function. The Anunnaki are rarely distinguished from one another, because distinction invites unpredictability. Uniformity enforces control. Uniformity is a hallmark of escape-driven systems. When retreating from instability, individuality is sacrificed for reliability. Procedure replaces personality. The Anunnaki reflect this shift perfectly. They are not celebrated as characters. They are respected as functions. This functional framing is itself a form of concealment. By embedding escape inside authority, the system avoids confronting what necessitated escape in the first place. There is no story about what went wrong. There is only a structure designed to ensure it does not happen again. The Sumerian tablets do not preserve a myth of failure. They preserve a mechanism of prevention. This also explains why the Anunnaki are not framed as teachers. Teaching invites growth. Growth invites change. Change invites instability. The Anunnaki do not teach. They judge. Teaching belongs to a world still willing to evolve. Judgment belongs to a world that must stabilize. Seen this way, the Anunnaki's authority is defensive rather than aggressive. It does not seek to expand influence. It seeks to prevent collapse. Escape language hides here as defensive architecture. If they had arrived to conquer, the texts would emphasize power displays, superiority and transformation. Instead, they emphasize order, silence, and finality. Silence is especially telling. The underworld is quiet. The dead make no noise. The noise problem that once threatened divine rest is solved absolutely there. Nothing escapes that silence. That silence is not peaceful. It is controlled. The Anunnaki preside over controlled silence. That is their most revealing function. This function only makes sense if noise once posed an existential threat. If the system once allowed too much expression, too much life, too much unpredictability. The escape from that condition would not be dramatic. It would be systematic. Authority would harden. Movement would slow. Boundaries would close. All of these changes appear in the tablets. The escape is never named because naming it would reopen the question of what was escaped from. Instead, the system moves forward with authority that assumes necessity rather than explains it. This is why the Anunnaki never justify themselves. They do not argue for their role. They do not explain their presence, they simply act. Justification is unnecessary when escape has already succeeded. As we continue, we will see how this hidden escape logic reshapes not only divine authority, but the very structure of the cosmos, how the world begins to function as if something dangerous has already been removed, and everything else exists to ensure it never returns. The tablets do not tell us what that danger was. They show us what was built to keep it gone. By the time the Anunnaki settle fully into their defined roles, the Sumerian cosmos no longer depends on constant divine presence to function. This is one of the most subtle yet decisive shifts in the tablets, and it fundamentally alters how power, responsibility, and survival are understood. The world does not collapse when gods step back. It continues, slowly, imperfectly, but on its own terms. This continuation is not presented as a triumph, it is presented as adaptation. Earlier layers of the tradition describe a world that requires frequent divine intervention. Gods speak directly. They correct mistakes immediately. They solve problems as they arise. Humanity is guided closely, sometimes clumsily, sometimes harshly, but always directly. This closeness creates dependency. The system functions because the gods are constantly involved. That phase does not last. As time passes in the textual record, divine presence becomes less immediate. The gods are still acknowledged, still feared, still obeyed, but they are no longer required to intervene at every moment. Processes begin to regulate themselves. Agriculture follows seasonal rhythms. Kingship becomes institutional. Law becomes codified. Ritual replaces conversation. The cosmos begins to run. This does not mean the gods disappear. It means the system no longer requires them to be fully present in order to remain stable, and that is a profound change. The Anunnaki appear precisely when this change has already taken hold. Their authority is not exercised through visibility or proximity. It is exercised through outcome, through what happens when rules are broken, through what happens when life ends, through what happens when fate is sealed. They do not walk among humans because walking is no longer necessary. This withdrawal of presence does not signal abandonment. It signals completion of a transition. The world has matured to a point where constant oversight would be inefficient, even dangerous. Too much intervention would destabilize what has learned to function autonomously. Autonomy, in the Sumerian worldview, is not freedom. It is burden. Once the gods step back, humanity must carry weight it did not previously bear. Decisions matter more, mistakes last longer. There is less room for correction. This is why judgment becomes so important. If the gods are not present to guide every action, then outcomes must be enforced when limits are crossed. The Anunnaki enforce those outcomes. Their authority is designed for a cosmos that no longer expects immediate correction. They are the final layer of control, not the first. They intervene only when processes have already run their course. This is why their presence feels distant but absolute. They are not involved in daily life, but they define its ultimate boundaries. They do not shape events, but they decide what those events mean when they end. A cosmos that no longer needs gods fully present must rely on structure instead of proximity, law instead of instruction, memory instead of guidance, ritual instead of conversation, writing instead of voice. The Sumerians understood this transition intimately because they lived it themselves. As their cities grew, as populations increased, as specialization expanded, personal authority gave way to systems. A king could no longer know every subject. A priest could no longer address every concern. Administration replaced familiarity. The divine realm mirrors this shift. The Anunnaki are administrators because administration is what remains when presence withdraws. They do not create meaning. They preserve boundaries. They do not inspire. They conclude. This also explains why the Anunnaki are not associated with innovation. Innovation introduces unpredictability. A cosmos that has reached its limit cannot afford unpredictability. Stability becomes the overriding priority. The tablets reflect this priority everywhere. Repetition increases. Ritual formulas harden. Lists multiply. Variations narrow. What once may have been fluid becomes fixed. Fixity is survival. A cosmos that no longer needs gods fully present is not a cosmos at peace. It is a cosmos under constraint. It continues not because it is flourishing, but because it has learned how to persist. The Anunnaki preside over persistence. They do not encourage growth. They regulate excess. They do not offer new beginnings. They enforce endings that allow the system to endure. This endurance has a cost. Distance replaces intimacy. Fear replaces familiarity. Authority becomes impersonal. The gods are still there, but they are no longer accessible in the same way. The Sumerian texts do not lament this loss directly. They accept it. Lamentation is reserved for destroyed cities, not for vanished closeness. The distance between gods and humans becomes normal. Normality is the final stage of withdrawal. This normality is what makes the absence of return narratives so significant. If the cosmos needed gods to return fully present in order to survive, the texts would reflect that need. They do not. Instead, they describe a world that has reorganized itself around absence. The Anunnaki are not waiting to step back into a role of direct governance. Their role exists precisely because that governance is no longer viable. They are the guardians of a system that must function without constant divine input. This also reframes their silence. They do not speak because speech implies dialogue. Dialogue implies change. Change threatens stability. Their authority operates without explanation, because explanation invites negotiation. Negotiation belongs to a world still forming. The Anunnaki belong to a world that must hold. The cosmos they inhabit no longer needs them fully present, but it does need them fixed in place. Their absence from daily life is compensated by their absolute presence at the limits of life. They are not near, they're inevitable. This inevitability is not dramatic. It is quiet. It is assumed. It does not announce itself. And that is precisely how a system functions once escape has already occurred. Not by running, not by hiding, but by settling into a configuration that can survive without returning to what once was. As we move forward, this distance will deepen even further. We will see how presence gives way to memory, how experience gives way to record, and how the Anunnaki, once perhaps closer, become figures known not by encounter, but by enumeration. What remains is not a living relationship. It is a structure designed to last. One of the quietest yet most revealing shifts in the Sumerian tablets occurs when the gods begin to be counted more often than they are encountered. Names appear in lists. Numbers are fixed. Groups are enumerated. Roles are catalogued. But scenes of presence, dialogue, and appearance grow rare. The divine does not vanish, but it becomes abstracted, tallied rather than witnessed. This change signals something profound about how the Sumerians understood the stage of the world they were living in. Counting is not an act of celebration, it is an act of control. You count what must be managed, you count what cannot be allowed to wander, you count what you no longer meet face to face. A shepherd counts sheep because they are no longer all within sight. An administrator counts labourers because personal knowledge has become impossible. A scribe counts gods because direct experience is no longer the primary mode of relationship. The Anunnaki are among the most clearly counted divine figures in the Sumerian record. They are repeatedly referenced as a group. Their number matters. 7 judges, a fixed assembly, a defined body. This numerical emphasis replaces narrative description. We're told how many they are, not what they look like, how they speak, or where they move. This absence of description is not accidental. It reflects distance. When gods are close, their actions dominate stories. When gods are distant, their existence is preserved through enumeration. Counting becomes a substitute for presence. This is especially clear when we compare earlier divine figures to later ones. Earlier gods are described through actions. They separate heaven and earth. They establish rivers. They bring forth life. Their presence is felt through transformation. Later gods, especially the Anunnaki, are defined through function and number. They do not transform the world, they regulate it. Regulation requires accounting. The tablets treat the Anunnaki almost like a ledger entry in the cosmos. They are listed when oaths are sworn. They are invoked when fate is fixed. They are named when judgment is rendered. But they do not appear. They do not speak directly. Their authority operates through acknowledgement, not encounter. This is the logic of systems that have outgrown intimacy. When a society becomes too large for everyone to know everyone else, identity shifts from personal recognition to record. Names are written down. Roles are formalized. Numbers replace faces. The Sumerian divine realm mirrors this exact process. The gods are no longer neighbors. They are institutions. Counting also implies finality. Once something is counted, it is closed. The number does not fluctuate. It does not invite expansion. The Anunnaki are not said to grow in number. They do not multiply. Their assembly is fixed. This fixity is critical. A fixed number suggests a closed system. If the Anunnaki were arrivals, we would expect uncertainty about their number. Newcomers would be added. Roles would shift. But the tablets show none of this. The Anunnaki are stable. Their count does not change because their function does not expand. They are sufficient for what remains. This sufficiency tells us that the cosmos has already been reduced to a manageable scale. Whatever earlier excess existed has been addressed. Population has been limited. Lifespans shortened. Direct divine presence withdrawn. What is left can be handled by a fixed administrative body. Counting replaces growth. The act of counting also removes ambiguity. When gods are seen, they can be misunderstood. They can inspire fear, devotion, confusion. When gods are counted, they are abstracted into certainty. Their power becomes predictable. Their role becomes defined. Predictability is safety. The Anunnaki's authority depends on predictability. Judgment must be consistent. Fate must be fixed. Outcomes must be reliable. Counting supports this reliability. It removes the possibility of surprise. This explains why the Anunnaki are rarely individualized. Individuality introduces variance. Variance threatens order. The Sumerian system cannot afford variance at this stage. It has already learned the cost of excess. So the Anunnaki become a collective, a number, a function. This transformation also explains why later cultures struggle to visualize them. A god who acts can be imagined. A god who is counted resists imagery. The Anunnaki are difficult to picture because they are not meant to be pictured. They are meant to be acknowledged. Acknowledgement does not require vision. The tablets reinforce this by shifting emphasis toward writing itself. Writing becomes the primary interface between humans and divine authority. Decrees are recorded, lists are preserved, rituals are written down, memory is externalized. Externalization is another sign of distance. When gods are present, memory is lived. When gods withdraw, memory must be stored. The Anunnaki exist within stored memory. They are known because they are recorded, not because they appear. This does not diminish their power. It changes its nature. Power that must appear is vulnerable. Power that operates through record is durable. The Sumerians understood this well. Their civilization depended on record-keeping, contracts, inventories, calendars, omens. Writing made society possible at scale. The divine realm adopts the same logic. The Anunnaki are part of that adoption. Their presence is encoded, not embodied. This encoding also functions as containment. A written list cannot move. A counted group cannot expand unexpectedly. The gods become fixed within language itself. This is the ultimate form of placement. Placement through enumeration. Seen through the lens of escape, this makes perfect sense. An escaped force that wishes to remain stable will avoid embodiment. Embodiment invites vulnerability. It invites interaction. It invites unpredictability. Abstraction avoids all three. By allowing themselves to be known through number rather than presence, the Anunnaki ensure that their authority remains intact without requiring engagement. They become unavoidable but unreachable. This unreachable quality is essential. The Sumerian cosmos no longer supports direct divine contact. It supports compliance. Compliance does not require vision. It requires certainty. Counting provides certainty. This also reframes the emotional tone of the texts. Fear replaces awe. Respect replaces intimacy. The gods are no longer companions in existence. They are conditions of existence. The Anunnaki, counted and unseen, embody this shift more clearly than any other divine group. They are not myths meant to be told. They are structures meant to be obeyed. And structures, once established, do not need to be seen to exert influence. As we move forward, this abstraction will deepen further. We will see how memory itself replaces presence, how stories give way to records, and how the divine becomes something inherited rather than encountered. The gods do not leave. They recede into numbers, and the world learns how to live under their count. As the Sumerian record moves forward in time, something quiet but irreversible takes place. The gods do not disappear, yet they stop appearing. Direct encounters fade. Speech becomes rare. Intervention becomes indirect. In their place, memory takes over. Not living memory carried by experience, but stored memory preserved in clay. This transition is not announced. It is not treated as loss. It simply happens, layer by layer, tablet by tablet. The earliest compositions still retain traces of immediacy. Gods speak. They argue. They act within the world in ways that feel close and tangible. But as the corpus grows, as copying and recopying become the primary act of preservation, presence thins. What survives is not encounter, but record. The Sumerians did not see writing as neutral. Writing existed because something could no longer be held in living memory. It was a response to scale, distance, and complexity. When a city grows too large, you write. When time stretches too far, you write. When presence can no longer be guaranteed, you write. The divine record follows the same logic. The Anunnaki exist primarily within written lists, formal invocations and ritual formulas. They are rarely characters in stories. They are entries. Their authority is embedded in text rather than action. This is not accidental. It reflects a world where divine presence is no longer accessible enough to be relied upon directly. Memory steps in to preserve what presence no longer provides. This replacement carries profound consequences. Living presence allows for flexibility. Memory does not. Once something is written, it hardens. Variations diminish. Interpretation narrows. The divine becomes consistent, but distant. Consistency is a survival strategy. The Sumerians understood that systems cannot depend on variable presence. A god who might appear or might not creates uncertainty. A god whose role is recorded creates stability. Memory becomes the guarantor of order. This is why later texts feel heavier, more repetitive, more procedural. They are not meant to inspire, they are meant to endure. Ritual phrases are repeated word for word across centuries because repetition preserves alignment. Deviating from memory risks destabilizing the system. The Anunnaki's authority is inseparable from this repetition. Their names are invoked in fixed sequences. Their number remains constant. Their role does not evolve. They are remembered, not experienced. This shift also explains why the emotional tone of divine-human relationships changes. Fear replaces familiarity. Reverence replaces conversation. One does not speak casually to a remembered authority. One follows what has been recorded. Memory enforces distance. This distance is not framed as punishment. It is framed as necessity. The world has reached a point where direct divine involvement would cause more disruption than order. Memory allows authority to persist without interference. The tablets show this clearly in how divine decisions are treated. Once recorded, they become precedent. Later events are judged in relation to earlier decrees. History becomes reference material rather than lived experience. The Anunnaki preside over this historical weight. They are invoked as witnesses to oaths precisely because memory does not forget. A God who is present might be persuaded. A God who exists in memory cannot be negotiated with. Negotiation belongs to presence. Memory enforces outcome. This is why the Anunnaki are so closely associated with fate. Fate is not an unfolding story. It is a fixed record. Once written, it is sealed. Memory transforms possibility into certainty. The underworld mirrors this function. It is the place where life becomes memory. The dead no longer act. They are remembered, if at all. The Anunnaki oversee this transition. They manage the passage from presence to record. In this sense, memory is not merely a replacement for presence. It is its final form. A world that relies on memory rather than presence has accepted that closeness is no longer sustainable. The divine is no longer a participant. It is a condition. The Sumerian texts do not resist this acceptance. They encode it. They preserve what must remain without attempting to revive what has passed. This also clarifies why return narratives are absent. Return would require presence to reassert itself over memory. That would destabilize everything that has been built around record and ritual. The system cannot afford that disruption. So the gods remain where they are, fixed in text, fixed in number, fixed in role. The Anunnaki are perfectly suited to this world. Their authority does not depend on appearing. It depends on being remembered, on being cited, on being invoked correctly. Their power increases as presence decreases. This inversion is one of the most striking features of the Sumerian worldview. Distance does not weaken authority, it strengthens it. The farther the gods recede, the more absolute their judgments become. Memory has no fatigue. It does not argue. It does not forget. The Sumerians built their civilization on this principle. Writing allowed them to outlast individuals, rulers, even cities. The divine realm adopts the same mechanism. The Anunnaki are embedded within it. They are not living gods in the sense later traditions would imagine. They are structural forces preserved in record. And once something becomes structural, it no longer needs to appear to exert influence. As we continue, this reliance on memory will reveal its final implication. We will see how the Anunnaki themselves come to be understood not as active rulers, but as survivors of an earlier order, preserved in record because they were what remained when presence could no longer be sustained. The tablets do not mourn this transformation, they depend on it. By the time the Anunnaki are fully situated within the Sumerian record, they no longer resemble founders, architects, or pioneers. They resemble something far quieter and far heavier. They resemble survivors, not survivors in the dramatic sense of fleeing catastrophe, but survivors in the structural sense. Those who remain after a system has already shed what it could no longer sustain. This interpretation does not require adding anything to the tablets. It emerges naturally once we notice what the texts emphasize and, just as importantly, what they no longer bother to explain. The Anunnaki are not associated with beginnings. They are not linked to the first separation of heaven and earth. They do not initiate creation. They do not introduce humanity. They appear after all of this has already occurred. Their authority is defined by inheritance, administration, judgment, and finality. These are not the functions of those who arrive at the start. They are the functions of those who remain at the end of a process. Survivors do not expand systems. They stabilize what is left. The Sumerian cosmos, as preserved in the tablets, shows every sign of having passed through an earlier phase that was more open, more direct, and more unstable. Gods interacted more closely with humans. Boundaries were thinner, consequences were less rigid. But that phase recedes into silence. It is referenced indirectly, never reconstructed in detail. What remains is a world built to prevent its return. The Anunnaki fit perfectly within such a world. Their authority does not invite participation. It restricts it. Their presence does not generate growth. It enforces limits. Their power does not seek expression. It ensures containment. These are the traits of survivors who have learned what excess costs. If we read the tablets as records of continuity after loss rather than stories of conquest, the Anunnaki's position becomes clearer. They are not new rulers imposing order. They are the custodians of an order that has already been reduced. They operate within a narrowed system, one that has learned to value stability over possibility. This is why their domain is the underworld rather than the sky. The sky represents openness, movement, and change. The underworld represents closure, fixation, and silence. Survivors retreat downward, not upward. They move toward control, not exposure. The Anunnaki preside where nothing escapes. This placement does not indicate weakness. It indicates adaptation. In a system that has already experienced destabilization, survival depends on minimizing variables. The underworld removes variables permanently. It simplifies the system. The tablets never suggest that the Anunnaki seek to restore the earlier cosmic state. They do not promise a return to longer lifespans. They do not reopen direct divine-human interaction. They do not undo separation. Survivors do not attempt to relive what nearly destroyed them. They enforce boundaries to ensure it cannot happen again. This enforcement is not framed as cruelty. It is framed as order. The Anunnaki are respected because they maintain that order. They are feared because their order is final. Fear here is not moral. It is practical. One fears what cannot be negotiated with. This practicality aligns with the Sumerian worldview at every level. The Sumerians lived in an environment where survival depended on regulation. Floods had to be anticipated. Harvests had to be managed. Labour had to be organised. Memory had to be preserved. Excess was dangerous. The divine realm reflects this same logic. The Anunnaki are not idealized. They are functional. Functionality is the hallmark of survival. If the Anunnaki were survivors of a prior order, their silence makes sense. Survivors do not tell stories about what was lost if doing so risks reopening wounds. They build systems that prevent recurrence. They encode lessons into structure rather than narrative. The Sumerian tablets do exactly this. They do not describe the earlier order in detail. They show us the safeguards built afterward. The Anunnaki are among those safeguards. They represent a concentration of authority designed to prevent collapse. Their judgments are inflexible, because flexibility failed before. Their distance is deliberate because closeness proved unsustainable. Their abstraction is intentional because embodiment invites vulnerability. Everything about them points backward, not forward, but not toward nostalgia, toward caution. This backward orientation is another sign of survival. Survivors measure present actions against past danger. They do not seek new horizons. They fortify existing ground. The Anunnaki fortify the deepest layer of the cosmos. They are not alone in this role. Writing fortifies memory. Ritual fortifies behavior. Law fortifies society. The Anunnaki fortify fate itself. Seen this way, they are not anomalies in Sumerian mythology. They are its logical outcome. A world that has passed through instability does not glorify beginnings. It respects endings. It builds around what remains. It counts what cannot be lost again. The Anunnaki are counted because they are essential to preservation. They are not many. They are sufficient. This sufficiency is the clearest sign that they are survivors rather than arrivals. Arrivals bring potential. Survivors bring limits. The tablets never celebrate potential when speaking of the Anunnaki. They emphasize necessity. Necessity arises only after something has gone wrong. The Sumerian scribes do not tell us what that something was. They did not need to. Their task was not to reopen the past, but to maintain the present. The Anunnaki are part of that maintenance. They are what remains when the world can no longer afford expansion. As we move into the final reflection, this perspective will settle into its quiet conclusion, not as an answer, not as a revelation, but as a thought to carry gently into rest. A thought about what it means if the most powerful gods in the oldest texts were not the beginning of a story, but the residue of one. Something endured, something did not. And the world learned how to continue anyway. As we reach the far edge of this exploration, there is no revelation waiting, no hidden name to uncover, no destination to point toward. Only a shift in how the story settles. The Sumerian tablets do not end with answers. They end with arrangements, with a world that has learned how to hold itself together after something fundamental has already changed. Throughout this journey, one pattern has remained consistent. The Anunnaki do not behave like visitors. They do not act like pioneers. They do not announce beginnings. They appear already positioned, already constrained, already embedded in a system that no longer resembles its earliest form. Their authority is heavy, quiet, and final, not expansive or exploratory. Everything about them points away from arrival and toward remainder. If that is true, then the most important movement in the story does not point toward Earth at all. It points away from something else. Not necessarily a place in the physical sense, but a condition, a way the cosmos once functioned that could no longer be sustained. The tablets never describe this earlier condition directly. They do not preserve its details. They do not romanticize it. They only show us what came after. A world of limits, of fixed lifespans, of mediated contact, of judgment replacing guidance, of memory replacing presence, of silence replacing noise. These changes are not framed as punishment. They are framed as necessity, as if the world itself had learned something it could not afford to forget. In such a context, escape does not mean running from danger in fear. It means withdrawing from excess. It means abandoning a level of closeness that proved destructive. It means consolidating power into forms that cannot be tempted back into instability. The Anunnaki fit this role perfectly. They do not tempt. They do not teach. They do not experiment. They enforce what must not be crossed again. Their domain is not the open sky or the fertile earth, but the place where motion ends and outcomes remain. If they are survivors, then they are survivors of a cosmos that once allowed more freedom than it could manage. A cosmos where gods and humans were too close, where boundaries were too soft, where consequences arrived too late. What we inherit in the tablets is not the story of that world, but the architecture built to prevent its return. This architecture is everywhere, in the rigidity of fate, in the finality of death, in the impersonality of judgment, in the abstraction of gods into numbers and lists, in the replacement of encounter with record, in the silence where conversation once existed. Nothing about this feels like the beginning of something new. It feels like endurance. And endurance is rarely dramatic. It is quiet. It is repetitive. It is heavy with memory. It does not ask to be admired. It asks only to persist. The Anunnaki do not ask to be believed in. They are simply there, counted, fixed, unavoidable. They do not need to appear because their role is already complete. They do not need to move because movement is what the system learned to fear. If they left anything behind, it was not a message, it was a structure that assumes something has already been lost and that nothing good would come from trying to recover it. This is why the tablets feel the way they do. calm, procedural, unembellished. They are not trying to awaken wonder, they're trying to preserve balance. They are records from a world that has already crossed its most dangerous threshold and chosen not to look back. And perhaps that is the quietest thought to carry into rest. Not that the gods came to shape humanity, but that they stepped back to keep something from happening again. Not that they arrived in glory, but that they remained out of necessity. Not that the story points upward toward origins, but inward toward containment. The Sumerians did not ask their gods where they came from. They accepted where they were placed. They lived inside the system that remained, and they wrote it down so it would not be forgotten. Now, there is nothing more to follow, nothing to solve, only the steady rhythm of a world that learned how to continue after retreat had already taken place. Let the story settle where it belongs, and let the silence do what it has always done best.